positions, and let's mute our microphones. Nicole, mute your microphone. Okay. All right. Who are the two men in this image? Raise your hand if you know. Who are these two men? Carolyn.
George Washington and
Colonel
Jefferson.
Colonel Henry Knox. So, who can retell how were these two men clever in their battle yesterday? What did they do that was clever? Ryan. Clever means smart. What did they do that was...
They are clever because
You need someone to help you out?
they wanted the general wanted with his men over the hill, the dirt hill they built that, and they wanted over and over the hill, and that looks like they had hundreds and millions soldiers, but they only had 8.
Very good. It was called the Battle on the Mound, and they made a mound of dirt. And then they had the soldiers walk up and around the mound over and over again, so it looked like there were hundreds of soldiers to the British, but actually there were only a few. Also, Colonel Knox had the idea it might look like we have more weapons if we go to this fort that we captured. When we captured the enemy at this fort, they left all their weapons behind. So Colonel and his men went to go gather the weapons at the fort and brought them back. Then, when the next morning, when the British general woke up and saw they had cannons and all those soldiers on the mound, they retreated, which means they left. And we won the battle. In today's read aloud, George Washington, the father of our country, George Washington needs to use spectacles to help convince the soldiers to continue to fight. What do you think spectacles are? It's an old word. What do you think spectacles are? Estelle?
Old glasses.
They're glasses, yes. Spectacles are glasses, eyeglasses. Leo's grandfather would put on his spectacles to read the newspaper. Nowadays, we call them glasses, and people of all ages wear glasses. But long ago, usually you only wore glasses when you got older and your eyesight wasn't as good. Another word we're going to hear is the word defeated. Say defeated. In today's read aloud, you will hear the American Army defeated the largest British army. Defeated means you won against or beat in a game or competition. To defeat them means you beat them, you won. Okay, in today's read aloud, you're gonna learn more about General George Washington. This is before he was the president. Listen carefully to find out how George Washington used his spectacles to convince his soldiers to agree with him and continue to fight for their freedom. General George Washington had been leading the American army for 8 years, trying to free America from the rule of the British king. Remember, even though we lived across the Atlantic Ocean, we were not free from the British king. He still owned us. And 8 years is how long they've been fighting this war. Most of you are 6 years old. 8 years is even longer than you've been alive. That's a long time. He and his men did not want to be controlled by a king. They fought many long and difficult battles for their freedom. When they lost some battles, George Washington convinced his soldiers not to give up. When they did not have enough food or blankets during the freezing cold winters, he tried his best to keep his soldiers' spirits up. He tried to encourage them to keep happy. Finally, George Washington and his men defeated the British Army. That means they won. Now that they had defeated or beaten the largest group of British soldiers, the American soldiers thought they could finally go home. They missed their family. But George Washington thought, the British still have one last army left. They could change their minds and attack again. We have to make sure the war is really over before we all go home. General Washington had to try to convince his soldiers to keep on fighting to the end. So you got to think about this. His soldiers have been away from their families for 8 years. They are cold, they are starving, and they are missing home. So George Washington has to try to convince them to stay. I think that's going to be hard to do. This did not make the soldiers happy. Besides not seeing their families for a very long time, the soldiers were not happy for another reason. They hadn't been paid in a very long time. They began to say to each other, maybe we should take over or take control of the new country. Then we know we'll be paid. We could make everyone do what we want them to do. Uh-oh. Is that good? Should they take over and take control and make everyone do what they want to do? That sounds like the king that they're trying to get away from, not a country where people are free. George Washington had heard about the soldiers' idea. This made him sad or disappointed. He thought, I'm proud of being a soldier, but I do not want soldiers to use their power to tell other people what to do. That would be just as bad as a king telling everyone what to do. We want a country where people decide together what to do, not kings or queens or armies. I must stop them from trying to take over. Washington took out some of the papers he had brought to read to the soldiers and began to read them out loud. When he finished, no one cheered or clapped. I failed, he thought. They are too angry to listen to what I say. Then he remembered something. Wait, he told the soldiers. I have one more paper to read to you. He took out that paper, but the writing was so small, he could not see it clearly. He held it away from himself and then held it closer to try to read the paper, but nothing helped. What could George Washington use to help him read the paper? Anya?
Spectacles.
Spectacles. Then Washington took out his spectacles and said, Gentlemen, you will allow me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray and older, but almost blind for my country's sake. The soldiers were surprised. They had never seen him use spectacles before. In that moment, his soldiers felt ashamed. They felt badly about their idea to take over the new country. They remembered how strong George Washington was before, and how he had always helped them and encouraged them. They thought, he has worn himself out and has become old and tired fighting for our freedom. He must really love this country. Many of the soldiers were so ashamed, they began to cry. They told one another, if George Washington can wait a little longer to get paid, we can too. He is right. The important thing is to make sure we start a new country where people work together to make decisions, not just a king or a queen or an army. The soldiers agreed to do as General Washington asked. They fought the war to the end, and later they did get paid. After the war was over, the Americans needed to choose the first president of the United States. Can you guess who that was? Jonyan?
George Washington.
Yep, George Washington. The people of the nation knew they could trust George Washington. They told him, we need you just a little while longer, not as a general of an army, but as a president. And as always, when the American people needed him, George Washington said, yes. All right. Let's answer some questions about what we just read. Who is today's read aloud mainly about? Nicole?
George Washington.
Yes.
And the soldiers.
Why was the American Army fighting against the British Army? Why was the American Army fighting against the British Army? Russell?
Because they want a free country.
Yes, they wanted to be free from a ruler. In today's read aloud, you heard that George Washington and his soldiers defeated the British Army. Does that mean they won or lost when they defeated the British Army? Adeline?
They won.
They won. Did George Washington think the war was over? No. He knew that the British soldiers had one last army left, and he told his soldiers to stay and fight that last battle. Did his soldiers want to stop fighting? Yes, they did. Why did they want to stop fighting? Who can tell me? Why did the soldiers want to stop fighting and go home? Anya?
They were hungry, they were cold, and they missed their families and they missed getting paid.
Yes, they were hungry, cold, and tired. They missed their families, and they had not been paid in a long time. They would use that money to send home to their family so their family could live. How did George Washington use his spectacles to convince his soldiers to stay? Ooh, how did he do that? Carolyn?
Can you say it again?
How did George Washington use his spectacles to convince his soldiers to stay?
Because this is the only, the last fight. If they don't fight, the country will be defeated.
Very good. Very good. Good point. But when George Washington got out his paper to read, and he tried to hold it closer, and then he tried to pull it back, finally he put his spectacles on to read, and the soldiers thought, oh no, even a strong man like General George Washington in charge of the entire army, even if he even needs glasses to read, that means he's tired, he's hungry, and he misses home too. But if he's willing to fight, then I'm willing to fight also. So it helped the soldiers understand that George Washington was equal to them. George Washington wanted to be presented as their equal, not as a ruler over them. And that's how he convinced them to continue to fight and stay. Anya? At the end, why do you think the people call him the father of our country? Nicole, no ma'am. Why do people call George Washington the father of our country? Ryan?
Because he was the first president.
He was the very first president. He was the first person in charge of our country, so they call him the father of our country. Excellent job, friends. You guys did a great job with this lesson. Tomorrow, we're going to learn about another president, Thomas Jefferson. He was our third president. We're going to talk more about him tomorrow. All right. Nicole, what's your question?